Hi, my name is David Agronovich. I'm a threat disruption lead at Facebook, and we're coming to you live from Munich Security Conference. I'm lucky to be joined by Alicia Wanless, a doctoral researcher at King's College London, and Thomas Rid from Johns Hopkins University, who just finished the book Active Measures, a book on disinformation. I'm excited to have a conversation with both of you. You've done a ton of research on the evolution of information operations. How do you feel these operations have changed over time? What are some new and interesting things that different changes in communications media have brought?
Would you like to go first, or should I go first?
Go ahead, Alicia.
Well, I guess I'll go now. I think that in many ways we're kind of overblowing what's happening and saying that it's something new. Information's always been used in conflict. It has been manipulated and used for strategic purposes for as long as humans have figured out how to do that. What has changed is the speed, the reach, and the ability of people to engage with it. And in that sense, I think that is quite different. But I think we should be careful of hyping things.
Yeah, I mean, there's a rich and very long history of disinformation operations and influence operations, really accelerating with throughout the 20th century, even in the intra-war period, and then really picking up post-World War II. But in some ways, many things stay the same, whether you balloon leaflets across the Berlin Wall and drop them in the GDR in East Germany, or whether you send tweets from east to west today. Some of the bigger picture dynamics have not changed. So one interesting one that usually doesn't get a lot of attention is that these operations are very hard to measure for the attacker, for the person or the entity engaging in disinformation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's hard enough when you're running a campaign, like a campaign to change people's perspectives, that you can actually measure from your own perspective and you know why you're doing it. But when you're looking at adversarial campaigns, it's next to impossible because A, you need to know exactly who was behind it, you need to know what their intent was, and you need to know their aim so you have something to measure against.
Yeah, well, I think it's even worse than that. It's hard for the adversary, for the agency itself, like for Stasi, for example, or for KGB in the Cold War. It was hard to measure the effect of their own operation because they usually were exacerbating an existing grievance or an existing conflict by pouring fire into, like, running an anti-Semitic campaign that fanned the flames of anti-Semitism. But there was real anti-Semitism as well. So at the time, after a time, it becomes really difficult to say, okay, this is what we created, and this is what was already there, because these measures are active. So the active components, like an active agent, makes it hard to measure.
So talking a bit about that, do you generally see that these types of operations originate organically based on things that are already existent divisions in society? Or are these created entirely by the actor that's pushing the operation?
I think there's myriad factors that go into it. And if you actually wanted to run something that would be effective, then you should already be, and I'm not advocating to do this, but if one wanted one to be more effective, then it should already speak to people how they think and what would motivate them and what would affect them. So the ones that seem to be catching more attention or potentially having more effect, again, it's impossible to measure that, would already be exploiting existing grievances.
Well, one very effective way of exploiting something that already exists is by stealing data and then maybe forging a little bit and then making it public in a leak. So this is a tactic that is also very old. Stealing and leaking, or today hacking and leaking. That's an interesting one. How has leaking changed if we suddenly can leak large amounts of data online?
Yeah, I actually just co-authored a chapter on strategic leaking and its role coming out in journalism and use in propaganda. And the line between people in power using it too as a means to get information out there, and also adversaries using it as well is extremely complicated. And there's a lot of gray space in that, and heavily manipulated.
Yeah, and one question that's really hard to tackle historically is, so we saw a lot of leaks of classified material, sometimes of unclassified material, often with some forgeries baked into the leaks or slipped into the leaks. And then as we move into 2014 in Ukraine, and 2015 and 2016, the leaks pick up again. You see quite a lot of them in Ukraine, sometimes with forgeries, often actually with forgeries still in the leaks. But in the 2016 election interference in the US, there was a little bit of tampering with data, but mostly there were no big forgeries in the leaks. So what does that mean? Is that a trend line now, or?
Right. And is that something that you feel has changed from, say, the traditional disinformation operations that occurred during the Cold War period? That there were just more forgeries in that period, or is that something new?
The use of forgeries has always been done. I mean, it was in the American War of Independence. The atrocity stories were faked and put into newspapers to encourage support for the uprising, essentially. I think more so it's the scale and access, the quickness of what you can access and manipulate and put out there that is more problematic. And then also because of the coverage around it, 24-hour coverage around this, it becomes really difficult to discern what can be trusted and not.
Yeah. I think the interesting change when we look at how forgeries are done is the craftsmanship involved. In the Cold War and before, obviously, it really required a lot of craftsmanship. Like forging a Russian print text in New York, there's a great case study from the 1930s, actually required Russian font in New York, different Russian fonts. It required, a print shop that can handle Russian prints, etc. It was artisanal active measures really in the Cold War and before. And today it's easy to copy paste a Google email header and forge the email content.
So one other topic I hope we could talk about was, as these operations have evolved, so have the efforts that can be taken to counter them, and the stakeholders that are necessary to do so. I'm interested in your thoughts on what the model for attempting to combat these types of operations in today's world looks like.
Would you like me to try first?
Go
for it.
How could we counter disinformation operations? I'll make a bit of a provocative observation. Anybody who tries to counter disinformation operations today runs into a dilemma. The dilemma is if we talk about them, if we raise too much awareness, you need some awareness so that journalists, who are still the most important multipliers, not social media platforms, but journalists, so that journalists are aware and readers of the dynamics of disinformation playing out. But at the same time, if you raise too much awareness, you write up and talk up and build up the adversary into something more powerful.
Credence.
Yeah.
Definitely give it more credence than what it necessarily had deserved in terms of its activity, unproven activity related to influence. I think whenever you're trying to counter something, you're already on the wrong footing and probably looking at it from the wrong perspective. I mean, what we need now more than anything is to actually prepare people for living in a hyper-connected information age, and we just really haven't done that as a society. And I think that our reaction is more to clamp down and regulate and censor the information space, which I think will actually put liberal democracy in peril. So what we do now and how we think about this, I think, should be far more strategic, but that has been a bit of a weakness, I think, perhaps in the West.
And multi-stakeholder, I take it.
Definitely multi-stakeholder. This should not be tackled by any single company. Absolutely. It should be definitely dealt with, I think, between civil society, government. Academia needs to be involved, and that work needs to be translated so that it becomes practical and understood. But this is definitely a societal issue that needs to be tackled at a very high level.
Yeah, I mean, we're discussing this here obviously at Facebook at the Munich Security Conference. So if we zoom in and do research on Facebook, how Facebook was used by some disinformation actors from a historical perspective, one thing is really difficult, and that is historical data on Facebook. Some data are available, but because Facebook doesn't allow internet archiving in the same way that Twitter does, it's more difficult to dial back in time and to look, for example, how big was the following of a specific, the subscribers of a specific page. So I think there's some interest. I wonder whether one could improve the conservation.
And so I think that's one area where we are actually making some strides, right? So we've taken some steps to put together things like an ads archive in not just the United States, something we'll be rolling out in the EU as well. Ways for people and researchers and the public to see not just what ads are being run, but who's running them and more information about the people running those ads. something else we've done when we do our information operations takedowns, as hopefully both of you have seen, is release more information about what we saw, what we understood to be happening on the platform, how many people were following it, what amount of ad spend was generated by those operations. So I agree. I think this is something that each of us have a responsibility to play. We as a platform have a responsibility to take action and keep things protected on Facebook. But at the same time, partnerships like partnerships with academics, partnerships with government are incredibly important.
But for example, one idea that I saw floating around is, and as far as I know, no social media platform has played with it. It may be an interesting idea to try, and that is to take a page or whatever, a tweet or a Twitter persona that was discovered to be an abusive an information operation, and not take it down, but only freeze it. Stop all interactions, maybe make it gray, so that it sits there like a gravestone as a warning for users, and as something that researchers can go back to.
Yeah, because pamphlets and things have endured. We have posters, we have things we can look at. But with the digital age, I mean, there's so much a lack of permanence in what has gone on that it will be very difficult going forward.
Totally.
Definitely. And I think I think all of us have things we need to do to improve. And one thing we are always going to be working on is how can we improve transparency in this space. So I appreciate your comments and your candidness in this conversation. I think we look forward to continuing to work on this problem and continuing to add to the corpus of research and information out there about information operations. So thank you both for joining me. Really appreciate the conversation. Thanks for tuning in.